Welcome to Awaken Podcast, episode 3, with special guest Daniel Ingram. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Happy to be here.
I'm just, we're honoured. We're honoured that you're taking the time. It's really fantastic. I just wanted to kick off this really just by saying thanks, but also for all the work that you do. It's been life-changing for me and my brother who introduced it to me. So like that, just wanted to kind of clear that out of the way, man. It is, thank you. Metta, all that good stuff.
But be grateful to the people who are kind enough to teach me. I'm very largely passing on things that people taught me freely and trying to pass them on in that same spirit of open, free Dharma. So, yeah.
Right on, man. Yeah, amazing stuff.
For those of the people listening who don't actually know you, Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Okay. I'm Daniel Ingram. I have been practicing meditation formally for about 26 years now. I run an online forum called the Dharma Overground, where you can connect with other people who like talking about practice. I run another site called firekasina.org. That's with a K, Kasina. And I also, I do that with some friends. And I have a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, an unusually hardcore Dharma book, which admittedly has been somewhat influential and has become something of a cult classic. God help the world. So that's a short story. Yeah.
Awesome. Brilliant. And just to sort of explain the format of this, we're aiming for, as I said, we're new to this, but we're trying to aim for something that's sort of conversational as much as possible. So feel free to ask us things as well. We don't have anything near the, I guess, the amount of experience and time that you've put into this stuff, but we're both meditators with a practice, and we're sort of keen to share and learn and grow and so forth in the spirit of sort of mutual adventuring that you mentioned in MCTB, which is Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. Yeah, so, wow. Perhaps I could kick off by just mentioning kind of where we're at in the world right now in 2020. For anyone listening back to this in the future, we are in the midst, me and Jasmine are both in London, and we're in the midst of a COVID-19 lockdown. We're a month into it now. I'm not actually in a beautiful forest, but I'm stuck in my home, and have been mostly for 4 weeks, apart from trips to the shops to buy food and things. So it's very strange. I listened to your interview with Steve James, and that was really interesting on the kind of your background in, what do you call it?
Epidemiology.
And
emergency medicine.
Yeah, and that was fascinating. So I just wanted to frame it with that moment in time that we're all in, and I'm aware that lots of listeners this will be foremost on their mind right now. Some of them will have a meditation practice, some of them won't. For those who are maybe getting started with meditation or thinking about it, or they have a practice already, what would your advice be to them?
So advice for people who don't have practices and those who do, all of them?
Oh, that's
general advice?
Maybe a bit of an overly broad question.
I'm sorry. It would be great if you could narrow that down a bit. Well, I don't even know where to begin with that.
Okay.
So typically, when I give people meditation advice, the first thing I do is I ask a lot of questions.
Yeah,
and that process might be an hour or an hour and a half, or even 2 hours. And I like to get their story. It's good to know where they're coming from, what they've tried, what they like, what they're trying to do, how they think about practice, how they conceptualize it, what it means to them, and what their resources are, and their psychological health, and their other lifestyle choices. And so there's a huge amount that goes into any conversation about what should, people might want to be doing. And so it's extremely difficult to do anything like that to a general audience. Particularly one that might have some breadth to it.
I think that's really interesting that you go almost like a consultant's point of view, or like as how someone might advise, like, let's say a personal trainer, like if you're asking someone for a new regime or like to create something, like where is your desired purpose? And I feel as though maybe I might be wrong. From my experience, people often don't have that take. So it's really refreshing actually to hear that you do, and taking into consideration where this person's really coming from. But that's only because I feel like you understand just the range of practices available at the moment.
And also something of the range of practitioners. I continue to routinely be surprised at people who fall outside my conceptions of the range, but still, I've now been talking to people about meditation for over 2 decades at length, and there is quite a diversity out there of perspectives, goals, capabilities, strengths, weaknesses, all of that.
What would be?
And if you don't take that into account, it's easy to say something that really, if you thought about it for another 5 minutes, would not make any sense.
Yeah.
What I would find interesting is then to ask maybe, what are some of the goals you might be working on, or like, where are you in your practice right now? I don't know if you'd like to even disclose that. You might even decline. I don't know, but that would
sure.
Be
no, I'm happy to talk about pretty much whatever. So open it up wide, go deep, go as deep as you want to.
Yeah.
My own practice, well, it depends on how you conceive of practice. So I think of 3 trainings: morality, concentration, wisdom, 3 broad categories. And I did a lot of wisdom training, which is what I started off with kind of first. And I guess I had done some ethical and concentration stuff along the way sort of too, but not as formally. And then I did a tremendous amount of wisdom. And then I sort of started filling in the others in some sort of reverse progression kind of way. And I got very good at deep meditation practices. It's true. I spent, a lot of time on retreats and practicing very hard, and got good at those, and made some upgrades to consciousness that were cool and seemed to be lasting as much as anything lasts in this strange world. And then what's left at that point is largely aesthetics. So the specifics of one's life, the ordinary day-to-day things, are the important thing, and how that relates to this interconnected world. And so a lot of my practice these days is an active practice of service. So I take calls and answer emails basically every day, at least one of those, and or respond to forum posts, and or do something else that is helping to create content or support other people's practice. And so that's an active service that I do. And I don't even take donations for that. So that's all just something I do for free. I also try to connect people together. So I do a lot of networking, where I'm trying to figure out how people can get the kind of support they need built more organically into their life, with peer networks and friends that are all exploring together, that have a very different feel than the sort of teacher-student hierarchies that a lot of people routinely deal with. So networking people is a big part of my practice these days. And that wasn't probably what you were expecting. You were probably expecting the meditation end. So I'll get there. But most of my time, I work, 6, 8, 10-hour days pretty much every day. If you ask my wife, she will tell you in some annoyed way how much time I simply spend here in this room, either writing or recording or editing or responding or talking or whatever it is, trying to help support practice. And so then in my own meditation practice, for example, I've done 2 3-week Fire Kasina retreats just this year. So I did 3 weeks in southern Germany, and then I was in London and Cambridge for a week, and then I did 3 more weeks in Hereford, on your beautiful little island, and then scurried out right as the borders were all closing and the flights were all ending.
Wow.
And came home here to Alabama, where I've now spent a month doing a lot of preparation, but also creative projects and helping people. And so in terms of practice, I love Fire Kasina. It continues to give me rich and fascinating rewards. I love the journeying that I do with close friends, and we go deep together, and we share meals, and we talk, and we practice together. That sharing, that sort of social context is an extremely vital and important part of my practice for me these days. Thinking about bigger organizational issues, so thinking about networking researchers together, thinking about interfacing with sort of bigger meditation movements, and thinking about some of the politics actually takes a reasonable amount of mind time these days. Thinking about the science, the literature, how to get various messages out there, and then how to empower bigger groups of people to help with that work. So it's very hard to do anything like all those things alone, but with more connected groups, it becomes possible. And so building those networks of friends and expertise and interest to help raise the level of dialogue a little bit is a big part of what I do each day. And then finally, my daily meditation practice. So what ends up happening these days is I'm basically working all day long, is at the end of a very long day, I sit down in my bed and sit there and practice and go through some insight cycles and stages. And sometimes the mind inclines to deeper jhanic experiences, and whatever happens, happens. That's cool. There's a lot of nice tracks my mind has these days that it likes to go down. And it'll pick one and go down it. And at some point to go, okay, time to go to sleep. And then I lay down and go to sleep and get up and do it all again. So that's sort of what my practice is looking like these days. But if you want to ask anything about any of that, go ahead, or we can talk about something else as you prefer.
Could you just briefly outline the Fire Kasina for listeners who haven't come across that?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is go to www.firekasina.org, which hopefully you can put links in the description somewhere.
Yeah.
But what you will find there is a practice which is old. This comes out of, it looks like it was actually pre-Buddhist. So it looks like they were doing Kasina practices before the Buddha. As far as I can tell from the texts, these are practices that were already in existence. And you would take one of the elements like fire, water, earth, air, or space, or a color such as white or blue or red or yellow, and you would make a disc out of it, or look at a fire, or look at a bowl of water, and you would just stare at it and then close your eyes, and you would get some kind of image, and you would try to concentrate on that image, and then eventually you've got nothing, and you open your eyes and you look at the kasina again. So a kasina is a Pali word that means an external image used as a support for concentration, or an external thing. Like you could use like a tomato, you could use whatever, the light on your phone, just don't look at it too long, it's pretty bright. But what we tend to do is use a candle. So it's a very simple practice. And what I like are simple practices done in high dose. And what you do is you take, in this case, a candle, you put it like about here, you look at the flame for a minute or two, you close your eyes, you see something, usually for most people it's a red dot or some purpley stuff or something, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And you focus on that with as much of your attention as you can bring to it, and it'll do various things, wander, move around, change, disappear, reappear, change colors, whatever, doesn't matter at all. And you follow that, just building concentration on the visuals, however they go. And then at some point you have nothing you want to concentrate on. You open your eyes, you look at the flame again, you close your eyes, and you do that again. And if you do that again and again and again and again and again, very, very simple, for 6, 10, 12, 14 hours a day, very quickly stuff starts getting quite weird and really interesting, and gets into territory that is a curious mix of deep concentration territory, insight stage territory, magical powers territory, and experiences that for a lot of people who have had experiences with psychedelics, very reminiscent of some of those sorts of experiences. So that's a delightful practice to explore, and it continues to produce rich rewards that I wouldn't have even known to ask for. But each time I do it, it gives me something else new and interesting, and I continue to be grateful for it. So I keep doing it.
Can I ask I didn't actually feel like I would ask a question based on meditation, but what would you say for people who maybe are quite sensitive to, let's say, if they've been practicing meditation in general and maybe see colors and so on, but I've had experiences where I feel like I've gone somewhere and then brought something back. And once it was like, I felt like I brought back a demon, for example. And in navigating that kind of a space, what would you say to people who maybe don't have a formal teacher? Like, would you stay away from like magical realms such as that? Like, I know a lot of people have this, like, I really want to have like cool experiences. Like for me, that had really taken me away and brought me to actually Vipassana, which was just very much in the body. So I knew that I wasn't going anywhere, and it was very grounded. And I'm wondering,
tell me something more about the demon experience, if that's okay.
So I was actually doing a pranayama style practice, incorporating. focusing on various different chakras. So you would initially start from the base chakra, and then you, after doing a set of breathing, focus on the top, and then slowly you would make your way up. And then you lie down, and initially it was a normal practice for me. I was with my cousin and my sister. It's a practice where you hold hands with one another. And my cousin was for the first time practicing, and he said he went into like a really, really deep space. So he wasn't even expecting that, because he thought it was just going to be a normal, peaceful, calming experience. My sister also had a deep experience. Mine was nothing out of the ordinary, normal, very deep, calming states. And when we came out of it, my sister left the room, and my cousin and I we could both feel in that corner there was something staring at us, and it had this very ominous presence, and it was terrifying, like, to not be able to see something but be terrified by it.
How long ago was that?
That was maybe 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. Yeah.
What kind of religious or meditative background were you coming from at that point?
I think very exploratory. Yeah. I was just doing various different practices. I had went to Bali maybe a year and a half before that, and experienced a lot of magical occurrences where I met, for example, nymphs in my mind space, and had conversations with them, to seeing normal, like having no thoughts at all and couldn't bring any thoughts to mind. Long periods of time where I just had calming states. So it was a mishmash of things, from sacred geometry to inner, I think it was called Inner Light, and then another one which was sound-based, and so on. So there was different.
So you were doing some magical practices.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that at that point it was a magical practice.
Talking to nymphs, not magical. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And then as it unfolded, I just realized that maybe I might be too overactive in my third eye space. I didn't actually know. So I started not practicing, because every time I did thereafter, I would get very cold and start getting ill. And it was slightly odd.
And have you read the maps that talk about a stage called the arising and passing away?
I haven't read any maps.
So if you're entering territory that you find disorienting or confusing, some people, though not everyone, find the maps helpful.
Okay.
And so if you're interested...
Bill did tell me recently to look at the maps. And so... Yeah,
if you're interested, you might find the maps normalizing and explanatory. A lot of people do. That's why they're there. They're obviously not the territory, but still having a heads up of the range of possibilities can be pretty useful. So back to the original question of demons. So that's one of the things we talk about, like on day one of a Fire Kasina retreat. We talk about it on the website. We have reports of people's encounters with things that they describe as demons, think are demons, feel like demons, look like demons, might just be demons.
Yeah.
And so obviously we've just lost some people just by saying anything like that. You're going to alienate a portion of your audience, and I recognize that. Apologies for whatever I've just done for people who are not so into that demon thing.
Yeah.
And so the problem is, though, is if you do magical practices, magical results can arise. And if you look at old magical books like grimoires, which are old magical texts, the vast majority of them are talking about entities and demons. That's where most of the magical party is for a lot of Western and Eastern magic as well. So if you go to Thailand, there's spirit houses all over the place. There's amulets that protect you against spirits. If you go to most countries that have sort of more indigenous or animistic or traditions, you will find those. And even Buddhism, original traditional Buddhism is chock-a-block full of entities. Way more descriptions of interactions with entities than there are descriptions of insight practice, like no comparison. And so you will find that these traditions expect those experiences. Like, of course, you're going to have interactions, or you very well may have interactions with entities. The first time the loving kindness practices were taught was actually to deal with some troublesome nature spirits that were harassing and scaring some monks. And
interesting.
This is just considered par for the course. Like, and when you do Fire Kasina or another similar practice where you're visualizing and or using a mantra, it's oddly common to have some sort of entity experience if you do that long enough. And some of the entities are benign or sort of vague. You may not see them. You may have a tricky time figuring out what they are, but sometimes they can actually be very full-blown, as realistic as waking life in full detail, like the best computer graphics or even better, and seem like living entities. And then the range of advice for dealing with that is a vast topic. And if we want to talk demonology and, proper demon etiquette and, various schools of thought on how to deal with them, I could do a whole podcast on that. And that might be fascinating. You would certainly get a very interesting early audience skewed by doing that. But the point is that then you have to sort of ask yourself, do you want to live in a magical universe?
Yeah, right.
And it's not like everybody has a choice, because sometimes our practices don't give us a choice in that. This is just what's showing up, and we have to deal with it. But to some reasonable degree, you sort of get to choose, so it appears, from a relative point of view. And so shutting down visualization, shutting down things, just explicitly making resolutions for these things to go away, doing active banishings, even of the most primitive kind, like, hey, you, shove off. I'm trying to use a polite term here. And something like that. Right? So, or then do you send loving kindness to these entities? Do you wish them wisdom and appreciation of karma so they will have skillful actions and get a better rebirth? What's the traditional advice you follow? So Buddhism would actually often recommend loving kindness practices. That's what the Buddha recommended. And teaching them the Dharma. Can you teach them wisdom? And other people would say, no, it's a demon. You need to treat it like you would treat an intruder into your psychic space or your house or something, and be more forceful. And I can, depending on circumstances and what's going on, and I can make arguments for lots of different possible reactions. It's a long topic again, but these things happen. And so if you're kind of freaked out by living in a world where there might be demons or entities or other experiences like that, then you might want to avoid some of the magical practices. Though in truth, some of my more profound experiences doing Fire Kasina actually came out of some very, very weird and sometimes scary and concerning encounters with what appeared to be entities from a magical point of view. And so there can be a lot of richness and discovery there. There can also be some weird and not nice consequences. And it's, again, a huge topic. But going into it without any training, without any heads up, without any warning, obviously, is incredibly disorienting for people, which is why on our websites and in the books, I try to give some basic advice and refer people on to other sources that go into more depth and detail about those kinds of topics, because these are areas of exploration that definitely benefit from having some theory and some tools and some frameworks, or a range of these things, a range of traditions to draw on, to have something more in your pocket than just, oh my golly, I don't know what to do with that.
This is fascinating.
So study definitely helps, I think.
It reminds me of
life.
Sorry, your story. So we've talked about this before. It's spooky, and I never mentioned, but it actually reminds me of stuff that happened to me in my teens. And I got very ill one time with a fever and had the most terrifying experience with an entity of some kind. That you mentioned that the loving kindness thing. I didn't know that was when Buddha first sort of introduces it in the sutta. How to deal with these these forest entities you've got trouble with. Teach them the Dharma through loving kindness or something. It's brilliant. And that kind of, something like that happened with me back then in terms of how I dealt with that experience. It freaked me out for, like, I don't know, a week or a month. eventually I had this kind of spontaneous, I could just like treat it with kindness experience, and it completely transformed my relationship to it. It might have taken a whole year. I don't remember how that played out, but it went from being like the most awful, terrifying thing ever to something that I'd kind of come to terms with through that process. And it's just very strange. Now you mentioned that, it just really brought it up. I haven't really thought about that stuff for 25 years or so, but there was a thing.
What was the experience like? Can you describe it?
So I don't know how much, my kind of cultural background shaped the experience, but I've got a very strong memory of kind of stepping out of my bedroom and being in a bit of a daze, and then encountering this thing on the landing that was, I just remember that like the muscle tone on it was like a bulldog or a Rottweiler. Like, when you've got muscles that are just like, you can see every vein, and it's like, this really like pulsing, dangerous thing. And it looked like, I guess, a 6-foot demon on my landing, I remember it being kind of brown, basically, kind of dark blood red brown. And it was the most terrifying thing ever. It just kind of completely freaked me the hell out. I didn't know what was going on. I was deep in this fever, and it just kind of, I don't remember what literally happened in that moment, but I think I backed off and kind of collapsed back into a daze in bed, and then had to kind of figure out how to deal with that experience over the next few weeks, because it kind of stayed with me. It was like any terrifying thing, it sticks with you. It's kind of post-traumatic stress or whatever. And it was just one of those kind of nightmare moments that happened when I was awake, but in this kind of fevered daze. And anyway, you brought it back to me there. But the metta thing's fascinating, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so now when you look back on that, what do you think of it? Have you had anything like that since then? Has it informed your practice? Have you related it to anything else?
I think, if anything, it hasn't informed like direct meditative practice, because I haven't gone spaces like that in meditation. So my background, I initially got into meditation really well. I had a kind of alternative upbringing. I was around ashrams and chanting and meditation and things. So I picked up on it as a kid and had some very exciting experiences that might have been arising and passing type things. This is meditation map stuff. Look at Daniel's book if this doesn't make any sense.
Sort of a peak experience usually. Yeah. What big first opening. Some people call it Kundalini awakening, or a lot of names for it. But
went through a few of those kind of things. It's a kind of jhanic thing when I was in my teens, and an absorption state, and then got really heavily into meditation in my 20s via Goenka's Vipassana centers, and did several retreats in that tradition, like half dozen retreats, and served a bit and so forth. And that was absent entities and so forth. It was quite straightforward kind of insight practice, and it didn't lead to any of that stuff for me. But there's something about the dream world that it has influenced, and I think that it relates to how I relate to dreams. That there's something in there that I do encounter things in dreams, as everyone does. Essentially, everyone encounters other people and the memories and all the rest of it, and perhaps entities also in dreams. And it's definitely that was sort of my introduction to that, almost in my memory, at least, of how I deal with that. And I can remember it shaping that kind of attitude of shifting from like just terror and revulsion, and to how can I be kind to this thing and change this experience into something better. And that seems to be remarkably powerful, at least in my own kind of lucid or near lucid dream states.
Nice.
I would love to dig more into this Kasina stuff, but I still, there's a question nagging at me that I was trying to phrase earlier, I think, which was, So you kind of touched on it briefly, Jasmine, in terms of, so is any dose of meditation safe? And if someone was listening to this who is new to meditation and they're stuck in their home in lockdown and they're thinking about meditating, what would your thoughts be on that? Perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to give a little bit of background to what I think is behind your question, if that's all right. So the background to this is that the Insight meditation maps, which are oddly reproducible and strangely predictive for a lot of people, though they have a range of presentations, just like anything, predict some specific stages that are not as much fun as the, glowing, happy women in their mid-30s in leotards on magazine covers necessarily seem to be promoting. And these stages can sometimes actually be profoundly disturbing and very troubling, as some of what y'all are describing can be scary, involve weird, energetic, magical experiences, involve mood alteration, involve strange movements, involve odd perceptual changes, and can mimic various illnesses, and sorting all that out can be complicated. And so the problem, there are a few problems with the question, is any dose of meditation safe?
Yeah.
And the first point is that nothing is safe entirely. So nothing we do is entirely safe, right? So I don't know if there's some contamination in this water. I just had my water line open yesterday and they were doing some work on it. Did some contamination get in it? And no, I'm drinking something dangerous. I don't know. Maybe. Is the air now entirely safe to breathe from coronavirus? No. Is stepping outside your door even entirely safe? Is picking up a package or getting the mail entirely safe? No. So is driving a car safe, or even riding on the metro or underground or whatever safe? No. So the point is, you have to say safer than what? Or more or less safe than what? Is just sitting around as a couch potato watching TV safe? Well, no. It's your muscles atrophying, maybe gaining weight. You could get exposed to all kinds of weird images, and who knows if that's entirely safe. Strange propaganda. There's plenty of it going around these days. Right? Is that safe for your brain and your heart and mind and all that in your society? Not necessarily.
Yeah.
And so, is Instagram safe? I don't know. Plenty of people, all kinds of things might not be safe. So it's relative. So I would also say that no dose of meditation is entirely safe. But so we're adults. We realize that everything we do involves some degree of risk. So I'm also an A&E doctor, as you would call them, or emergency medicine physician, as we would call it here. And though I retired 2 years ago, I spent a long time practicing, and I took care of a lot of patients. And I would take care of people, say, I was just walking down the sidewalk and all of a sudden I twisted my ankle and their leg is now broken. And you're like, that didn't seem that dangerous. And yet, or they were just doing the simplest of things and just, bent over to pick up a napkin that had fallen on the floor and blew out a disc in their back. And you're like, really? Really? Yeah, really. So you don't know. So putting this in perspective, meditation, not entirely safe. It can cause weird mood instability. It can cause some very strange experiences, both highs and lows. It can cause things that look a lot like mental illness. And that said, it can also be extremely transformative, just like an exercise program. When you go to exercise, you recognize you could pull muscles, you could hurt yourself. If you're jogging, you could get hit by a car or sprain your ankle. Whatever you're doing that seems like it might be good for you could end up being bad for you. And meditation is like that also. You're changing the code while the operating system is running in your brain. That doesn't always go so well, sometimes in the short term and occasionally in the long term. But it's the kind of thing that if you're going to go into it, I think you should have more information. So I very much advocate for, as something kind of from the medical model, discussing with patients the risks, benefits, and alternatives, what we call the RBAs. So this is what might happen if we do this that's bad. This is what might happen if we do this that's good, like some procedure or some surgery or give you some antibiotic or whatever it is. And these are the other possible options that you have. Well, unfortunately, meditation is kind of just like being alive, just with a little more attention to it, except that being alive while you're paying attention is sort of meditative. So tons of things we do are already meditative. So from a certain point of view, you're already low-level meditating. If you're just paying attention while you're brushing your teeth, if you're just tuning into your body and relaxing stuff as you're going to sleep, as you're doing anything, there is reality, there is experience. You're relating to it with some degree of attention or awareness or concentration. You're paying attention to what's going on. And so life, from a certain point of view, is already intrinsically kind of semi-meditative, but some things are clearly more so. Right? Some things seem to produce more reliable meditation effects and depths of concentration and stillness and wisdom and insight and clarity and precision of mind and acceptance and all of the things that we hopefully try to cultivate in our meditation practices. Well, plenty of other real-world activities are already doing plenty of those. And so the problem is, even by having no formal meditation, life experiences can throw you into insight stages and routinely do. Actually, the vast majority of people I know who I talk with got into insight stages before they started doing formal practice rather than the other way around. And when I say formal insight meditation stages, I'm really talking about crossing the arising and passing away, the stage we've mentioned, which can involve openings of consciousness and initial highs, though for some people it's scary and troubling. And so that also happened to me. I had almost no formal meditation training as a kid, and I got into these experiences, and so have a number of family members, and it sounds like so have a number of you. Even if you had some light training as a kid, you were still you're just kind of playing around with a lot of it probably. And plenty of people wander off and they do a yoga course and it involves some breathing and stillness and meditation, or they take a psychedelic and they don't really think of it as a meditative thing. They were just out partying and they wanted to have some fun, some weird experiences, and all of a sudden they find themselves in territory that is traditional, spiritual territory, dealing with traditional insight stages, when that's not really what they signed up for. And so life, it can do this. And so is any of this, is being conscious safe? No. In fact, explicitly being born is not safe. The outcome is guaranteed to be something not good. And so all that said, if you're going into meditation, I would highly recommend you read something of the maps. So I'm going to, again, plug my own works because I can't help it. www.mctb.org, where you will find my book for free, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. Or if you want to pay something, you can go online and buy a print copy. Fine. And all of that money I use for other Dharma projects. I don't actually keep any of it for myself. It all goes into something creative or something to help produce content or editing, further, versions of whatever document or something like that. So I use all that money. I give it all back. So I'm not doing any of this for the cash. And so you can find lots of information there. Chapter 30 in particular is the one that talks extensively about the maps. And it references a whole bunch of other books, such as A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield, which I highly recommend, that also give takes on this territory just in somewhat different voices and with different emphases. And hopefully that will give you a sense of what you might be headed for just by being alive, but more likely headed for if you start going into specifically spiritual experiences and practices.
That leads really nicely to another question that I have on the maps. So the maps, Daniel, the maps. I know that you found the Therevadan tradition. So this is, for anyone who doesn't know this, well, perhaps you could introduce what the Therevadan tradition...
if you want to, usually
Therevadan, however you pronounce this stuff, I don't know. The Therevadan thing, and why do you think that their maps are particularly useful, or they've been particularly useful for you?
So each religious tradition has its strengths and weaknesses, the things they do well and the things that maybe they don't do quite as well. And while lots of people like to think of their tradition as doing all of the things the best, in truth, that's not true. None of them have it all totally together. Sorry for the Theravada or anybody else that I'm then disparaging. But the thing that I think the Theravada, one of the things that it does unusually well, is clear, straightforward, relatively non-dogmatic conceptual frameworks that have a certain almost modernity to them, that have a certain technical lexicon-like quality to them, that have a certain organization and precision of thought that you really don't see in quite the same way in any other religious or spiritual tradition. And it's not that lots of other spiritual traditions don't have a lot of good, technical, precise information in them. They do. but I have looked at every single one I can find, and nobody holds a candle to the Theravada when it comes to clear, actionable, technical, descriptive, phenomenological language that is reproducible, that holds up today, and has almost some of that clinical diagnostic quality that I do love about medicine. So one of the great things about medicine is it's been willing to just describe diseases and health and wellness and molecules and treatments, and to study them and to refine that and to try to come up with frameworks that, for all the problems with allopathic medicine that are vast, and as we all know, that said, that is one of the things that it really, as part of its ethos and aesthetic, tries to do well. In that same way, the Theravada prides itself on clear maps, clear descriptions, clear lists, and having a certain straightforward, non-flowery, non-poetic, but just kind of technical, down-to-earth, clear vocabulary for describing experience, reality, and practice that nobody else touches. Even it's like the Tibetan Buddhism, as elaborate and grand and vast as it is, doesn't have that clear, simple down-to-earthness that the Theravada does. Zen, nothing close to it. Poetic, beautiful, mysterious, interesting, quirky, yes, but clear and technical, no. Vedanta, the interesting maps of like the Yoga Suttas of Patanjali, great, and they sort of try for something that, but they still don't match it. And again, I don't mean to be all tradition comparative, or my tradition is better than yours. There are lots of things that all of those other traditions do very well, that maybe the Theravada doesn't do as well. But on this particular topic, nobody else holds a candle. And still today, modern neurophenomenology, modern spiritual maps, attempts to describe this territory, they still haven't topped it. And so from my point of view, 23 to 2200 years later, the Theravada still wins. I say this a lot and it annoys people, and yet I continue to put out the challenge. Well, if you've got something that's actually better, show me, bring it.
Why do you think it annoys people?
Because people don't like the fact that some tradition might have stuff their tradition doesn't, because most people are coming from a tradition. They have a loyalty to their guru or their teacher or their conceptions of spiritual practice. And that's most of the people that are probably going to be listening to this. And they may have biases against maps, and they may not like it being all cookbooky and technical, and they just like it to be free and open, and it's all their unique journey, which, for better or for worse, is actually not true. So when you listen to lots of people describe meditative territory, more and more and more, to me, it just all sounds like the same thing. It's kind of like in clinical medicine. Appendicitis is just appendicitis. This person's got pneumonia. This person's got this. And while there's some variants and interesting things about each of those, this is just that. This is just that. And in the same way, this is just the A and P. This is just the dark night. This is just equanimity. And you see them again and again and again. And it becomes sort of routine. Like, okay, here's this thing, just like you'd expect in the order, in the sequence. And with some variants and variations that you pretty quickly learn. And then it all just looks like the same old territory. And that also rankles people who really want it to be so unique and powerful and profound and special to them. But it isn't. There's not much new under the sun. And there are some interesting...
Yeah, so people might still, it might still follow the guidelines, but it doesn't make it any less special, Right. I feel like it shouldn't take away from the person's experience because it's been said.
Yes.
Just because you go to a theme park and you see, Thought Park, which we have, just because you've been on the ride doesn't take away from any other ride that anyone else has been. It's odd. I find it strange.
I agree. And yet the maps really annoy some people. As a person who spent a lot of time advocating for the maps and talking to people about the maps, some people react to them quite strongly and negatively. And so I've got to acknowledge that. And they don't work for everybody. For some people, they become an annoying source of comparison, of self-judgment, of second-guessing, of striving, of future mind, of competition. I've seen all of those in spades, and they detract from people's meditative experiences. They try to take grand phenomena and cram them into dark little boxes. In fact, literally just before we started recording this, what I was writing this morning was an essay on how someone had tried to cram a bunch of beautiful Fire Kasina practices into some old maps that really didn't fit them, and how painful it was to read those descriptions, when the Fire Kasina practices can be quite profound and beautiful just on their own and don't really need to be crammed into mappy terminology all the time. So I myself can have those same sorts of anti-map reactions when I don't think they're used well or appropriately, or where they seem to detract rather than enhance. So all true. But that said, plenty of people getting into this territory would have benefited from a heads up to the weird stuff that could be possible. Or if it starts happening to them, to have normalizing frameworks and to realize they're not alone, that the stuff may have been well described, that they may not be broken or crazy, or that even if they are kind of crazy, it may be a kind of crazy that was sort of expected, or at least something that's been described. And here's what you might be able to do about it, because not only have they spent 2,300, 2,500 years exploring this territory, they've also given a lot of advice that's come down both in written and oral form about how to handle some of the strange territory. And then in contemporary times, me and my colleagues have spent countless thousands of hours and countless thousands of words exploring, reading about, and helping people to navigate in this territory, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, seeing what's helpful, and how you can sort of predict what might be better for someone. And that refined terminology and technology is incredibly helpful for people, as the people who have a capacity or an interest or an aesthetic that allows embracing it, show again and again in their own lives.
Fascinating, Dan. I wanted to just digging into that, really. So to frame the question, my background, as I mentioned, is via the Goenka Vipassana law, which is basically the Therevadan thing, right? He was taught by someone Burmese, and it was sort of part of that thing. Okay, I know it's adjacent.
It's if the Theravada is this, Goenka is that, and a strangely selected amount of that.
Yes, of which I've become aware in the past 6 months.
There's some cool things about Goenka, but it's also extremely artificially limited and dogmatically and rigidly so, in a way that even excludes a lot of important Therevadan map technology. Which is weird, because it largely came out of U Ba Khin, who is teaching mostly from the Visuddhimagga, which is the most elaborate description of these maps we have in the old texts and commentaries.
Right.
And yet the Goenka the tradition refuses to normalize this for people and tell them what's happened to them when their consciousness explodes and they're freaking out, which happens by the thousands every year. And they refuse to tell people about this stuff, despite the fact that they know these maps, and they even come straight out of the tradition they come from, which is so ironic. And it's like, what are you doing, kids? Come on.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, it was a real revelation for me getting into your work and people like Kenneth Folks around you on the maps. And it seemed to instantly frame a lot of my experiences really well.
Well, yeah.
And so my big question about this is, I suppose, maps versus territory, and how much scripting do you think goes on when you've got a map? As I now have, I've read your books and looked at some of the early suttas on this stuff, and now I can see. I'm just wondering, like, how much do you think it scripts people, basically? And you've been through this, right? Okay.
So all the criticisms of the maps are true.
Yeah,
every single one of them. The scripting, the expectation, the detracting from experience, the future mind, the striving, the comparison and competition, the arrogance, the misapplication, the total overcalling and undercalling of their practice, the needless terror, the unnatural fascination, all of the things. Every single person who says, detracts from the use of the maps and thinks they should be kept secret. Every single thing they're saying is true. All of them. So good on you, people who hate the maps and want to keep them secret and not tell anybody about them. You're right. Totally. That said, the other side is also true. Yeah. And the other side is that they can normalize, they can be incredibly stabilizing, provide access to a large amount of technology, be deeply intellectually satisfying, help connect you to other traditions, to other maps, to other teachers, give a conceptual language and lexicon for describing experiences that allows conveying of information much more efficiently, sometimes assuming that they're used well, and all of that. So both are true. It's kind of like allopathic medicine, which I know a lot about. For about 20 years. allopathic medicine, amazing. We save lives. We stomp out disease. We do all these incredible things, and we cause all these problems. Every time I give somebody an antibiotic, I cringe. Am I going to cause an allergic reaction? Am I going to give them Stevens-Johnson syndrome or Clostridium difficile? Am I going to kill them? It happens, right? And so, like, when you're doing this stuff, you recognize I'm doing something good, and at the same time, I'm doing something bad. And the maps are that. And that said, most of the time, I still think the maps, their benefits outweigh their downsides. And so I still advocate for them, but I advocate for them, again, with appropriate qualifiers. So I'm willing to talk about both the good and bad sides of the maps, just like the rest of it, risks, benefits, and alternatives. The alternatives to the maps are crashing around in territory with no idea what the hell is going on. And I've gotten to talk to literally hundreds, if not thousands of people, I think thousands by this point, and read thousands of forum posts of people who, for example, went on a 10-day Goenka retreat, crossed the arising and passing away, all the energetics and amazing stuff, hit the dark night, which follows it like thunder follows lightning, and then freaked out and wrecked their lives. Right? The Dharma Overground has literally thousands of these people on it who didn't have that normalized, didn't have that explained. We're not expecting that. They just expected to get calm or have an interesting experience, or their friends said it was really cool, so they did it. And then here they are crashing around in territory that is well known, and yet the tradition steadfastly refuses to tell them about. Ouch! Right? And I think that's dangerous. And I think that just having a blanket policy that nobody gets to know this, we're not going to tell people about it, even though they know it. It's straight out of the books they came from. It's straight out of the Burmese Theravada they came from. Actually, it's way pre-Burmese, but generally loved and appreciated by a lot of Burmese teachers, and very much a part of Burmese meditation culture. There are exceptions, but mostly. And so I'm extremely frustrated that it's a tradition that seems to have no capacity to revise itself and to do something that I think is more ethical and skillful. And that's frustrating, because there's lots that's great about Goenka. They keep the money clean, right? They're teaching good basic techniques. They do some things that I really like, and they make it accessible to so many people. So good on them. Can you just step up your game a little bit and use stuff that came straight out of the books that your tradition came out of? And come on, not hard.
I found it very mysterious. Also, it's been a big source of confusion for me since I started reading this stuff. I've just been like, damn, why didn't they tell us? Why? It's the same tradition. He was taught by people who have that in their books.
Right.
Why? It's complete mystery to me. I've got some guesses on why it might have happened. And some of the stuff that I've heard you talking about, and how in the Burmese tradition, they just found that if they just taught noting to people, then for some people that was enough. They could get lay people in the temples. They would just teach them how to note, and job done. They would kind of get awakened in 6 weeks or something.
And when you mean just noting,
go ahead and explain, Daniel. You know better than me on this.
Okay, so it'd be like, so this is straight out of Mahasi Sayadaw practice, which comes out of a sutra in the Majjhima Nikaya, middle-length discourses of the Buddha, called One by One as They Occurred. And basically what you do is you make a one-word note of what's going on. So if your breath is rising, you just go rising. If it's falling, you go falling. If you're thinking, you note thinking. If your mind is wandering, you note wandering. If you experience pain, you note pain. If you're experiencing pleasure, you note pleasure. And you try to keep the notes relatively simple, so you don't, but don't get too neurotic about it. And you just note, this is what's going on. This is what's going on. It basically turns the thinking mind, instead of into your enemy, to something of your friend that helps keep you grounded in experience. And it's a very powerful technique. It's the technique that got me a lot of my early insights. I'm incredibly grateful for it and a big fan, but it doesn't work that well for everyone. And some people need some more, but some people you just tell them to note and they wake up. Straightforward, if they can just follow simple instructions. And so if you're interested in this kind of practice, you could look at a book called The Practical Insight Meditation, which you can find for free online by Mahasi Sayadaw. And it'll give you simple instructions and you can follow them. That said, some people need more than that. They need more guidance. They need other frameworks and conceptualizations and some psychological stuff and lots of other answers to their theoretical questions and handholding and maybe, parents or something. Anyway, sorry. They need a bunch more, and that won't be enough for them. But it is true that if you give that to some people, then they will make really good progress in an amazingly short time, which is great.
So, yeah. So do you think that Goenka was inspired to teach this sort of very strictly limited version of Vipassana because of that?
So I have an inside scoop from a friend who I don't know if they would want me saying their name. So I'm just going to say, I know someone who was also there back in the day when U Ba Khin was teaching Ruth Dennison and Robert Harry Hoover and Goenka and the two others, the woman and the other guy, whose name for whatever reason I'm blanking on at the moment. But the point is that U Ba Khin taught all of them from the Visuddhimagga, which is a big meditation manual, Path of Purification by Buddha Gosa, that you can look up and find. It's free for download online. It's a great hog of a cumbersome text, but amazing. It's sort of like an encyclopedia. And he would look at each of these practitioners who were all different. They all had totally different styles, different needs, and he would teach them each different stuff that was appropriate to them. What's interesting is that since he was teaching them each individually, apparently back in the day, none of them realized the degree to which U Ba Khin was giving them all something that was not unique, but very, very custom tailored for them, for what was going on with them, for their difficulties, for their strengths, for their goals, for their personality style, because the Visuddhimagga has all that technology built into it about different techniques for different types of people and different remedies for different imbalances. And he was combining that with his own insight and training and wisdom and skill and crafting some custom tech for each of them. And apparently, they all then, after studying with him, tried to teach together initially. And apparently it was a mess. It was a mess because they hadn't realized how differently they were each being taught. And they were saying things that were totally different, totally at odds. And so they apparently rapidly all went their own ways. And apparently Goenka-ji did not have dark nighty problems, right? He was this big, reassured, confident, powerful person who the dark night and the maps were not much of a thing for. And furthermore, when he taught, I know some people who sat with the man back in the day, and they said, and people who now know the maps, and they said his presence, his confidence, his reassurance, his energy somehow transmitted. And something about that just carried people through the hard stuff. He inspired so much faith that people just did the techniques. They grew in wisdom. They kind of got this transmission, this resonance, this support by his energy and his faith, his own faith and confidence and competence. And so they didn't really need any of that when he was around, apparently. So I've heard. So Goenka didn't need it for his practice. He wasn't taught it. The people he was teaching because of him, apparently he was sort of part of the secret sauce that made this map-free combination work. They didn't really need it because he somehow held them in this space of like, you know, he was a big, like big confident Indian guy. And so they didn't recognize that without him, and in some practitioners, it might have been incredibly relevant to have this tech. And then Goenka said, if you don't change the tradition and you keep it just like I've taught it, and you keep the videos and you keep everything the same, then it will last for, 500 years or something. I can't remember the quote. And if you don't, then it will degenerate. And so there came this notion that they shouldn't touch the tradition, which I get that. They respected the teacher, and he said it, and Goenka was impressive, and he created this amazing organization, and he helped a lot of people. So I understand where the conflict of the tradition comes. But that said, I really still think it's time for change. And I know that annoys the tradition, and it creates the possibility of a split. And that absolutely sucks. And like, what a mess. And still, I can't help but have my opinion based on my own experience of having conversed and written back and forth to countless hundreds of people who have had serious downsides from not having these stages normalized for them and explained.
Do you think maybe like if there was a way to maybe just keep the tradition as it was, but then also say, this is a resource that if this does happen to you, then here's where you go?
Well, is that keeping the tradition as it was? So is that just teaching exactly like it was from the exact videos, doing it exactly the way he said to do it? That's not the same. And the problem is the traditionalists rightly point this out. They say this is an alteration. This is a change. Right. This is not what Goenka Ji said to do. And so there's no mechanism by which you can still upgrade it and still be true to the tradition. So it has a certain simultaneous stability and also a quality that the progressives look at and find stagnating, constricting, and repressive.
Yeah.
And is it, and that it inhibits growth and development of something that admittedly has a lot of impressive aspects to it and has been in some ways very successful. And I think now the largest meditation tradition in the world in terms of running retreats by far.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's just challenging because it's like with any religion even as well. It often doesn't update unless, I don't know, all the ATs got together and then were just consensual in saying, okay, well, maybe there should be a shift. Or I don't know, but I had served on one course and I said, actually, for a plant-based diet, this is very, very niche, but I'll say it anyway. For a plant-based diet, it's better to have like rapeseed oil than sunflower oil because of the omega-3, 6, and 9 ratio. So I said, and it's also very cheap as well. And just changing that. And they said, well, you would have to look at this. And then there's like all these structures. And I said, but it's a very simple thing by just choosing something else that will ultimately be much more beneficial. So even just a small change like that is very interesting. I found serving sometimes challenging because of that.
Yeah.
Just everything needing to be the same. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting, your thoughts on Goenka there, because the video sadly can't answer your questions anymore, right?
Right.
We can't talk with him. I met him very briefly when he visited the UK once, and he absolutely had that kind of aura. He was just a very warm, friendly guy, and you instantly felt good being around him. So I could totally imagine that working. Like anyone I've met who actually attended a course with him just had nothing but good things to say about the guy.
Yeah.
Very, very warm. So as I mentioned, getting into your work 6 months ago, it was quite a big shift for me and opened up lots of possibilities and techniques. And one of which I tried out was the Fire Kasina. And it's been like an absolute revelation for me. And it just in terms of like doing something different in meditation, but also something that worked in a really profound way and introduced me to the jhanas, basically. I wanted to ask you about why do you think it's not kind of more of a theme in Buddhist meditation? Because it's such a simple thing, essentially, staring at a light. I have this is my meditation focus right here, and I look at that, and amazing things happen very quickly that I didn't even know you could do that. I've been meditating 20 years, and boom, it was like sitting on a moving skateboard going downhill when I started doing this stuff. It was just this instant rush of power that enabled incredible things that I didn't know were possible. So, why? Why is it falling out of favor, Daniel? What happened?
So I don't know all of the history of what happened to the kasinas.
Yeah.
So they're first described very briefly in texts about 2,400 years old, something like that. And then they're elaborated on more in some commentaries that happened around the 1st century AD. And then even more thoroughly described, that's a book called the Visuddhimagga, or The Path of Freedom, by the Arhat Upatissa. And then more thoroughly described in the Visuddhimagga, the book we continue to mention by Buddhaghosa, which is part of the commentarial tradition. And what's interesting is these books go on and on and on about kasina practice. This is a time when ink and paper were valuable, when even preserving a book was a project, having it not eaten by insects or destroyed by rain. to transport them. They were big, complicated things to produce. And these books are thousands and thousands of words.
Yeah.
Large tomes. And they dedicate tons of time to Kasina practice. And so it was valuable to them, because to remember something, to transmit it, to write it down was cumbersome, and they would not waste it on something they didn't think was extremely useful.
Yeah.
And then what happened between the 5th century AD or 6th century, somewhere around there, and modern times? I don't know. We have very few records of that period. We don't know. There's oral tradition. There's, monasteries. There's, the order nearly died out in various places, had to be reconstituted. There's the stuff that happened in India with Mughal Empire and the other people who basically obliterated most of Buddhism in its native land. We have different teachers who resonated with different practices, and all the strange stuff that happens in the telephone game, of transmission of the Dharma. As we can see, it morphs and changes and warps constantly. Even people I've taught, and teach, things that are totally different from anything that looks like me. And the people who taught me, I do things that are totally different in some ways from what they said. And so it gets filtered through individuals. And then what happened? I don't know. But what I do know is that these techniques nearly disappeared.
Yeah.
And I didn't know really anybody who was teaching them or talking about them, except when I mentioned them to Bhante Gunaratana, who has a book called The Path of Serenity and Insight, or the Jhanas is an earlier version of it, which was his PhD dissertation. This is a Sri Lankan scholar, monk practitioner who came from Sri Lanka, which is a place that also values jhana practice, and they value it. So they're like jhana first and then insight most of the time, rather than say insight first, which is some of the Burmese people, although not all, such as Pa Auk Sayadaw is more jhana first, right? And so that means they'd go into deep concentration states and then turn those into insight, which is one of the ways that's definitely described in the old text. So I understand why they might do that. It seems very traditional and canonical. And he would briefly sort of answer a few questions about Kasina practice. And you could tell he had done it, but he never talked about it in his Dharma talks. Nobody was doing it. He didn't teach it. He just wrote about it very briefly in his books. But I read the old when I found the Visuddhimagga and the Visuddhimagga, and I was reading these old books, I was like, oh my golly, they cared about this. This was a thing, and this is how they were getting into deep jhanas. This is how they were getting powers experiences. This is how they were getting insight. This seems crucial. What the heck? And then that dovetailed with my friend Honey Bunny. And Honey Bunny was my sister's husband's sister's, well, now ex-husband, who was also a magical practitioner, and he was talking about drawing pentagrams in the air. And for the lesser beneficial ritual of the pentagram. And he was one of my few friends I could talk with meditation about for a few years during some of my graduate school training days, where I really didn't have much of a local sangha, and the internet was nothing like it is today. And so he would talk about drawing things in the air. And I was like, well, how do you draw things in the air? He's like, well, you visualize the color and you do this. And I was like, well, that sounds like kind of like a Kasina practice. He's like, wow, that actually might really help. You could try using those practices to see if you are able to use them to leverage then being able to do these rituals and actually see the things you're drawing with your finger and the things you're visualizing. So I started playing around with that. And they also, in the magical tradition, have practices where you do stare at a candle and get more concentrated on the candle. And I looked in the books and they said, yeah, Fire Kasina, definitely a thing. And one of the highest of the Kasinas, along with the light Kasina and the white Kasina, they sort of group them all in sort of the same category. And so I started experimenting with this on retreat. I said, well, look, nobody's going to teach me this. I can't find it, but it seems really important. I'm just going to figure this stuff out. I'm going to go back to the old books. I'm going to play around. So I started playing around with it on my own and kind of figured it out. Now, today, if you actually want to get instruction in some of the stuff, you could actually go to Burma or one of the people trained by Pa Auk, and you could get some instruction. They might do it a little bit differently from me, use some different words, but it's kind of a lot of the same stuff. And so then you will find that there are these incredibly powerful practices, but why in the world they're not taught more broadly? My thesis is that part of it is just the sort of reaction of modernity and scientific materialism to the woo-woo and the weird, which this is, right? Very quickly, this gets into the woo-woo and the weird. I think also a lot of meditation teachers, even who have run into it, really don't want to deal with their students walking around having powers and crazy experiences and demons and stuff. Like, that's not what your average overcommitted Dharma teacher who's got a 10-minute interview with you every 2 days and 120 people sitting out there has the time to handle responsibly. Like, what a crap show that would be, right? Like, seriously. So even if they were just being purely responsible and they had purely good ethics and motivations for doing this, okay, I get it. Cool. Maybe that was the right move. And a lot of people just haven't studied this. If you're coming from Zen or a Tibetan tradition, you wouldn't have run into this. Tibetans, in all honesty, have lots of visualizations and mantras, which are in some ways get you into very similar territory. So related, but all that stuff is taught in secret mostly with lots of initiations you have to go through and a lot of support with a guru that's helping you to navigate it and all that stuff. So they try to build in a lot of safety tech and material and support and constraints on who actually gets access to that. I get it. And then you have crazy people like me who will just teach this to everyone and post lots of descriptions and say, hey, let's all be wizards or whatever and witches and go crashing into wild meditation territory, which is definitely not always a good idea, as sounds like both of you have noticed. So maybe I'm the irresponsible one and they're the sane ones. I can't be sure. But those are possible reasons that this stuff isn't more broadly known. Any thoughts?
It's very interesting, and you sort of answered another question there. And like, I was wondering, like, is this just easy for me due to my current condition, state, karma, whatever? Or if you taught beginners, would this also be really powerful? If they just said, okay, just sit down and like stare at this candle, right? Okay, great. Have you done that?
Yeah.
And how was that experience?
Wild ride.
Yeah. So was this someone with no meditation experience or just a bit?
Not much, and never done a retreat.
Oh, okay. So first retreat experience as well.
Yeah.
Oh.
And in a small sitting group of some practitioners, most of which who were sort of low-level beginner to low-level intermediate practitioners, and yet they still got into some interesting territory pretty quickly.
Yeah. And how did you find, were you kind of coaching that, helping them through it?
Yeah. So that's what I was doing back then, a long time ago when I was running a local sitting group. That was in Louisville. About how long ago was that now? Quite a while ago.
Right. How was that experience?
It was simultaneously very rewarding and validating to see these ancient techniques being dusted off and getting fresh new life in new people and proving their power and their worth. And also, you got to inform people, hey, like, do you want to live in a magical universe? Do you actually want to do this stuff? Do you want to be crashing around in wild territory that's pretty strange? And give them an appropriate heads up so they know what they're getting themselves into.
What would you say about, like, those who don't want to be living, and like what kind of practices they should maybe start initially looking at instead?
Well, so the problem is that any of these practices can actually produce magical experiences. It's more a question of shades of gray. So if you're just focusing on your breath, less likely, or your feet or walking practice. If you're doing a bunch of eyes open stuff, less likely. Movement-based practices, more like yoga, like hatha yoga with mindfulness, and or some of the qigong practices, depending on so the ones that don't involve a lot of visualization of energy channels and stuff, because the more you start getting into the energy stuff rather than just the movements, the more likely the magic gets. So basically, more visualization and more mantra and more creating things in your mind that most people would not hear or see. Those are the practices that are more likely to lead you into magical territory. Obviously, psychedelics, one of the things that can lead people into magical territory, and often much less integration there because it tends to be something of a crash course and has that sort of edgy, kind of distorted quality that psychedelics can sometimes bring, though sometimes profound for people. I'm not advocating for or against psychedelics here. That's something somebody needs to make their own choices and be appropriately aware of what makes sense for them in the place that they are, and laws and all that, whole nother issue. But basically the more physically grounded and less visualize-y and less mantra-y the practice, the less magical it's likely to be. But that's not necessarily true at all. So I know plenty of people who have had magical experiences that were doing extremely physical practices that were way on the grounded side. So no guarantees. But that said, I know other people who do tons of practices that you would expect to produce a lot of magical experiences, and they don't get much. So there definitely seems to be something different about different people. Some people are just more prone to this stuff, but you don't know until you've tried.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Daniel, I'm aware we've been chatting for a while now, and I want to be respectful of your time.
I'm fine. I can go on.
Good. I mean, is there anything you'd like to ask us, or I'm going to shut up? I feel like I've been talking too much.
Yeah. What do you all hope to get by doing this podcast? What are you trying to help your audience feel, do, or understand? What are your goals?
I mean, I think, to be honest, half of it is just I find this stuff fascinating. So me and Jasmine, we started. I'm aware I'm now dominating the conversation again. Sorry, Jazz. We started chatting about meditation a little while ago. We only met recently, and we just had so much fun sharing our experiences that we thought it would be good to do more of this and record it potentially, and potentially bring in other people to talk about stuff. Jasmine, what are your thoughts on it?
So, actually, I had a student who said to me, Jasmine, we have a lot of interesting conversations, but I feel like a lot of other people who are my age would benefit. And we weren't actually speaking about meditation in general, but it was more about consciousness, living more intentionally, mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And we have a group in London called the Awaken Circle, but it's also worldwide. You might know of it. And there are a lot of practitioners who every time we meet, so usually we sit for an hour, then we go through a reading, everyone shares their perspectives, and then the host has cooked for us. During that time, it's really wonderful, and so many great conversations are happening, but I just thought, okay, so if I could share this, how would I do that? And so I actually proposed it to Bill and one other friend. What would that be like if we just had conversations? And then Bill started saying, well, we could actually have other guests on. So initially it was just going to be us speaking about interesting things. And so,
what are the topics that you found the richest that made you think, oh yeah, this is something we should record, or oh, I really wish we had recorded that conversation so we could share it?
I think it's when because each person who comes to these community circles are so different. It's this like coming together with such different mindsets and mind states as well as just like personal life circumstances that lend to, there is no one specific topic, but just what unfolds. So that's why initially in this podcast series, we didn't want to have it so that it's like an interview Q&A, but more of a conversation that flows in such a way that information can just arise as it is, because I find that that's often what's most nourishing, or finding and exploring new spaces.
Nice. So something about the conversational aesthetic itself of the open discussion of our deep experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is that, totally. I mean, it's really interesting dynamic to figure out, because having a guest on like yourself, Daniel, it's to me a rare opportunity to talk to someone who's really dug into this stuff to the extent that you have. So I wouldn't. So sometimes I've listened to podcasts where they have guests on, but then the host just ends up talking over them for half the episode. I'm like, come on, give the guy space here. Like, I'm actually more interested in what the guest has to hear than you. So I'm aware of that, and I don't want to sort of hear too much of myself on this. But I think I really like what you were saying there, Jasmine, about the conversational dynamic. There's something in that things emerge out of conversations that don't necessarily come out of interviews, and that's really interesting side to life, really.
And I feel like it's also when, like, for someone like yourself who I don't actually know, Daniel, it would be that you might be speaking about other things that in daily conversation, you might say to friends that you have, but you might not specifically share in Q&As or something, because it's been targeted in such a way that the Q&As are trying to find something out, right? So it's not as versatile, it's not as open and like open-handed and open-hearted, I feel, in some ways, but this is just the vibe.
And then there's also the problem of recording itself. So when you record audio, you skew what people say. And when you record video, you skew how they move, how they hold their face.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's awful tricky. Even if we had some kind of perfect recording rig that would just pick you up wherever you were, whatever you were doing, it all sound good. But we're all kind of fixed here in these little boxes, trying to try not to move too much.
What we also wanted to do was maybe take away from even having video. So ourselves, we would have video, but when we would post it up, it would be that we had animated characters. So it kind of lent to freedom of you could be wherever you wanted. You could like walk around, you could be standing up, and it wouldn't really matter, but it was more just about the conversation that was happening. So just interesting different ways to frame things and have it as rich as possible. And in the future, we would like it to be in person so that it wouldn't have to even be over like call. If there were people who were in London in the same city as ourselves, then that would just be amazing. And of course, having the internet has facilitated being able to meet yourself. So there's benefits to both.
How about for your own practice? What are you up to these days?
Should I go?
Go ahead.
For me, I actually also began after that kind of a demonic experience in just the Goenka practice, something a lot more grounding. And so I'm working up to 3 hours a day again. And I do a lot of journaling, which for me is like, so poetry and process it. It allows me to go into, I think, various different places where I can be more systematic in my thoughts, structural as well as like explorative. And I teach emotional intelligence and mindfulness. So there are a huge range of practices there. And I'm finding a lot more that everything is becoming more integrated in my daily routine, in the moment, like self-management continuously. So I feel like having both the more neuroscience based as well as Goenkas, I feel like they merge really well. And I didn't know about any of the, I think I heard about these maps maybe 10 years ago, but I didn't really think about it. And I'm actually someone who prefers to practice, and so there is so much information I find that we have, but we don't have it integrated. And so for me, a lot of the time it's about practice. And I find like in this moment, from many different directions, a lot of theory has come into place, or people who have been advising me towards looking at theory. And it feels like it's the right moment. But for a long time, I said, like, I don't really want like this. And so it's slowly shifting. That's where I am.
Yeah, my practice is pretty limited at the moment. I'm a dad and holding down jobs. So I'm managing like maybe an hour a day, an hour and a half a day, sitting in one or two sessions. And I've just been exploring jhanic territory, absorption states, for anyone who doesn't know the jhanas, on a very light level, I think, but building on stuff in your books, Daniel, and also Lee Brassington's Right Concentration, a few other places. And that's, again, a kind of scripting kind of question, I suppose, for me, because it's been uncanny for me how I've gone through those meditations and kind of unexpected things have happened, And I've been like, what the hell was that? That was really different and really strange and not like the previous sits. And then I go to the suttas or your book or Lee's book, and it's just kind of there. It's, oh yeah, that's probably third jhana or whatever. So that's been fascinating for me recently. It's been a real playground, basically.
Nice.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So that jhanic map, how much do you think that is scriptable, or is there something like, as you've mentioned about insight stages, it's like they're almost like embryonic stages that are so kind of predictable for people. Do you think the jhanas are like that?
Yeah, I think the jhanas fundamentally describe different distinct attention modes that are physiological, that they're talking about something in the underlying structure, something in brain connectivity of the phases, of the pulses of attention, of the widths of attention, of various ways we process feelings, experiences, the body. And I think these are intrinsic. And you can take those to various degrees of depth, sort of dimensional thinking of jhana versus categorical thinking, only this certain experience is jhana versus is one way of thinking it versus, shades of gray. I had more bliss today or more concentration, sort of two different ways of thinking about deep meditation experiences, both interesting and both sometimes useful, are sort of superficial to the deeper question of the fact that I truly believe from my own experience and some playing around with fMRI and EEG that the jhanas are just part of the mechanisms we are given by which we attend to things, and that they develop in ways that generally are just extremely predictable and expected. Having taught bunches of people on retreat and having done a lot of this myself and gotten to witness endless reports of my fellow co-adventurers on the path, I'm way beyond the possibility of somebody convincing me that that's not true. Just the evidence seems to me overwhelming. This is just something intrinsic in human attention and its function, and can be developed to various degrees of depth, but is something at the level of structure and genetics and nature. That said, can be augmented and modified by nurture.
It's fascinating to me. I mean, the fact that these experiences I have seem to mirror these 300-year-old texts like that, it's quite amazing.
Again, I think they were just extremely good attentional anatomists. Just like when they describe the gallbladder in ancient Greek and Egyptian books, we still have gallbladders. It's not surprising that that's still true. In the same way, it's not surprising that attention still develops the same way.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff.
Jasmine, I was wondering, what were the 10 years where you were looking at the maps and people might have been saying these were interesting or something you might benefit from? What was going on your side that made you think, I don't want to look at those, not interesting, something off about them, not appealing?
I think it might have actually been longer than that. I initially, when I first heard about it, it was when I was growing up, and we lived behind a Buddhist temple, and there were different books on the walls and different images and descriptions of things. And I just thought it just looked all a bit crazy. You just see it and it looks like something out of, a fairy tale or a story. Yes. And I think after when I saw it again, I was maybe about 15, and I wasn't really practicing meditation either, or what I didn't not intentionally. And so I just thought, I never associated myself to be a Buddhist either. So I never wanted to, I don't know, I just didn't have the inclination to delve into it. It didn't seem to be helpful at that time, or I wasn't so interested as well. Which is where I was. And only now, again, has Bill mentioned it? So there's been huge gaps between even hearing about it. And I also think maybe you were saying that you had like a local Sangha, and
a long time ago.
Oh yeah. Or like maybe you have a community with whom you practice with, like your friends and so on. And it's interesting, that kind of a concept of community, where maybe it would have popped up more if I had other people who I was meditating with more regularly, but only now is it slowly coming that way, that I'm wanting to form a community like that, or a circle. And then Bill just happened to pop in to that. But nothing otherwise against the nuts.
Cool, just curious. Thank you.
I actually have one last question. It is, do you think it's necessary to have a teacher? And if so, how might one look for the right teacher?
Wow. Okay, so that also could be an entire podcast.
Okay.
Right. It's a huge question. So trying to get it to a really quick answer, it's both yes and no.
Okay.
Is it true that teachers can be incredibly helpful, that they can sometimes see things in seconds that might have taken you years to see about yourself? Can they sometimes just give a word or a phrase or a technique or a something that saves you a staggering amount of trouble and pain and complexity and difficulty? Absolutely. Yeah, so I've benefited tremendously from the teachers I've been lucky enough to have and to find, and very, very grateful. The chances of me figuring the stuff out on my own without all that, almost nothing. That said, I did come up in an era where there wasn't nearly as much good information available as there is today, not nearly as many freely available online videos. Back then, you might have had to order something from a tape library and order a book from Sri Lanka, and now all that stuff is available for instant download on PDF. Now the problem is too much information, rather than not nearly enough. And so it's a different set of issues today. There are many, many more people teaching meditation of an extremely wide range of quality, an extremely wide range of financial and cultural relationships. I myself have a strong predisposition against involving money and the Dharma because I think it's intrinsically corrupting, but there are a lot of teachers now who like to be paid, often extremely well, for their time. I can understand the arguments they make for it, but hopefully they can understand mine against it. And that said, there are a bunch of bad teachers out there too, who misdiagnose, who give terrible advice, who like to keep people dependent, who want them to be their students, who keep doling it out in little bits, who keep things mysterious, who are not empowering, who do not teach with an open hand, who do not teach freely, who violate the social conventions of ethics and societal norms and the religious tradition of freely given high quality ethical Dharma. And all of that. And so it's a mess right now. And it's an amazing mess. It's a remarkable mess. And we're actually extremely lucky to have this particular mess in comparison to a lot of areas where you wouldn't have had anything like this access. But all of that said, one needs to keep one's wits about them. If someone is saying, I have the true way, the best way, the most special way, just run. I'm sorry, that's just bullshit. It's just not true. There's so much good stuff out there right now. And the vast majority of your teacher needs to be your own experience. This fathom-long body, this needs to be like 95% of it. And the theory and all of that is cool and helpful and supportive. I'm obviously a big fan. I wrote a 320,000-page book about meditation theory and practice, right? I do lots of podcasts and videos. Okay, guilty as charged. But that said, if 95% of it isn't your own practice, your own experience, your own application of simple techniques in reasonable doses, then something is out of balance and wrong. And you're going to end up dependent and or financially exploited and or a part of some cult and or something like that. So keep your wits about you. Good luck. And right here, a whole lot of answers to be found right here. And one of the most delightful things for me, who actually is not anybody's meditation teacher, the vast majority of my calls are one-offs. we never talk again, or email answers just a few back and forth, and then it's done, and I refer them to other people. So I'm not trying to become anybody's meditation teacher, just in case anybody's asking. I'm not trying to. Seriously. I'll answer a few questions, and then I'll try to figure out where to send you. But the vast majority of people are ending up dependent, stuck in these weird relationships, something hierarchical, and looking out there. And from my point of view, what feels so satisfying is when I run into people who have finally made that turn. And this is where they are looking for their answers. And if they run into real trouble or something that's really throwing them, and somehow all the theory that's freely available and all the good meditation tech and help and maps and time aren't unsticking it, okay, I get why they need help. But it's the feel of people who are, rather than you, and you answer this, and you tell me this, and you help me with that. That's so annoying to me, and seems like people who are stuck in some sort of adolescent state, and maybe that's just where they are. Okay, I get it. But vastly more comfortable is when people are like, no, I'm finding it here. I'm looking within. I've turned it back. And there is some suffering, and there are some moving sensations, and there are some thoughts, and I'm going to relate to them skillfully. I'm going to do this well, and deal with hindrances and find truth here. That's what feels good to me. And I think that's how you can tell you've got something healthy going on, is when this is the vast majority of it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah, because a lot of mine has been internal work, and it's just then that because there's so much out there, then it's, am I also then supposed to be looking? It's like that, that slight doubt.
Sure.
Yes. It was wonderful to have you on and to be hearing about just your vast knowledge and like dispensing it so freely and openly.
Again, people were kind enough to do that for me. I pay it forward. Hopefully that tradition will continue a long time.
Thanks so much, Daniel. It's a real pleasure. And thanks for all the work that you do. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah.
www.integrateddaniel.info is the website where you'll find the links to all the other stuff. And then the Dharma Overground and firekasina.org are also good places to look.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I hope to speak to you again.
Vimeo. I have some videos on Vimeo.
Oh, yeah. Vimeo too.
Yes.
Brilliant.
And any links will be put in the description.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Awake In Podcast. We hope you enjoyed. Check out the show notes, listen to more episodes, and find our socials at our site, awake-in.com. We'd love to hear your feedback, so do please get in touch.